It is, of course, undeniable that there remains the possibility that a bump at some place or other is connected with a particular property, passion, and so forth. One can imagine the murderer with a high bump here at this place on the skull, and the thief with one there. From this aspect, phrenology is capable of still greater expansion, for in the first instance it seems to confine itself to connecting a bump with a property in the same individual. That is, the individual possesses both. But natural or everyday phrenology, for there must be such a science as well as a natural physiognomy, already goes beyond this restriction. It not only declares that a cheating fellow has his bump as big as a fist behind his ear, but also asserts that not the unfaithful wife herself, but the other conjugal party has a bump on the forehead. Similarly, one can imagine the man who is living under the same roof as the murderer, or even his neighbor, or going further afield, imagine his fellow citizens and so forth, with high bumps on some part or other of the skull, just as well as one can imagine the flying cow that was first caressed by the crab that was riding on the donkey, etc., etc. But if possibility is taken not in the sense of the possibility of imagining, but in the sense of inner possibility, or the possibility of the notion, then the object is a reality of the kind which is a pure thing and is and should be without a significance of this sort, and therefore can therefore have it only in imagination or picture thinking. In paragraph 336, Hegel is going to contrast two kinds of possibility. One which he is associating with the imagination, and that's got, you might say, a wider range, at least of imaginary possibility. And then there's what he's calling here inner possibility, or the possibility of the notion, and that seems to be in some respects more restricted. As we're going to see, if we reflect on what's going on here, it's not actually more restricted, because the only, if we want to play on words a bit, only actual possibility is that of the inner possibility of the notion. The other kind of possibility, which seems to be much wider, we might call bare possibility, or not really possible possibility. Again, they'll make more sense as we go along. So he begins by saying, it's undeniable that there remains the possibility that a bump at some place or another is connected with a particular property, passion, or so on. And this is what phrenology has been asserting. And we've seen that in order for it to work, there's a lot of assumptions that would have to be made about the way in which the skull and the brain interact, and what spirit is like, and all these sorts of things. But Hegel's going along with this now just for a moment, and he's going along with it in a way that really has something to say to modern philosophy and to late modern philosophy as well. So he says, look, it could really, no, not even really, it could be imagined to be the case that some sort of bump would correspond in some sort of way, unclear at this point, to something having to do with the brain, which then has to do with the person and who they are as an individual. We can imagine this. So he says, we can imagine the murderer with a high bump here at this place on the skull, and the thief with one in another place, right? And he says, from this aspect, phrenology is capable of still greater expansion, for it seems to confine itself to connecting a bump with a property in the same individual. Now, what is Hegel doing here? Is he really proposing that we should engage in what he's calling the natural or everyday phrenology? No, he thinks that this is even more off base than the pseudoscience that pretends to have some sort of rigor of phrenology that you can find, textbooks on from the 19th century. Instead, what he's doing is he's doing a reductio ad absurdum. He's going further and further with the absurdity of this doctrine in order precisely to show us that it can't possibly work as it's purporting to. So he says, natural or everyday phrenology, for there must be such a science as well as a natural physiognomy, goes beyond this restriction. So what might we imagine it to be saying? It says a cheating fellow not only has a bump as big as a fist behind his ear, but it also asserts that not the unfaithful wife herself, but the other conjugal party has a bump on the forehead, betokening lust or something like that. Similarly, one can imagine the man who's living under the same roof as the murderer, or even his neighbor, or going further afield, his fellow citizens, with high bumps or something like that on one part of the skull or another. So what is he saying here? This, if we're going to play around with arbitrary connections, and we're going to do it out of imagining things, well, we can imagine things going even further. Why does it have to be the person himself or herself who is the thief, who has the bump? Why couldn't it be their cat? Why couldn't it be the parson down the street? Why couldn't it be the person who does their dry cleaning that has the bump? I mean, if we're going to imagine that bumps somehow are connected with character traits, the bump doesn't necessarily have to be on the same person, because we can imagine it, right? So what is he doing here? He's showing us the absurdity of relying so much on imagination for revealing possibility to us. He says, we can just as well imagine the flying cow that was first caressed by the crab that was riding on the donkey, and so forth and so forth. And think about these, songs that we have about these improbable circumstances that people sing at summer camps about bumps on logs and all these other things that go along with it, right? Or there's the hole in the bucket, dear Liza, and you have to go through this whole progression to get to what is going to fix the bucket, All these sort of things can, in fact, be imagined, and it's a lot of fun to do that. But if our goal is to develop something that we want to claim as a science, something that we want to call Wissenschaft, a way of knowing, right? Wissenschaft, Wissen is knowing, knowledge, right? And then the Schaft, a way of, a technique of, a mode of knowing. If we're going to do this, then phrenology is really falling short, unfortunately. And the crazy, super imaginary phrenology is just as bad and actually no worse than the discipline of phrenology. So what is Hegel going to conclude here? He's going to say, you can imagine whatever you like. That's the problem with imagination. So we probably don't want to rely on imagination and the sort of pseudo-possibility, bare possibility, imagined possibility that it can provide us with as a guide, as an index. Instead, we need to think in terms of what we might call real or actual possibility. What really is possible? And that is going to be something that the notion, the concept, thinking through things in a conceptual, begriffliche way, is going to reveal to us, not this arbitrary imagining. Here, I think, in a certain way, what he has in his sights are Hume and Hume's successors. If you look through Hume's works, you will find that he gets a lot of mileage in a negative way out of saying that really, we can't have any assurance in things like, say, a priori proofs about God's existence or that sort of thing, because we work from analogies, and really when it comes down to it, if we could imagine the possibility of anything that would confute these proofs, or make the analogies weaker, anything along those lines, then we should reject it, right? It's being used in a negative sense. Phrenology is doing something similar, but it's doing it in a positive way that's saying, oh no, we can know something about the world. We can know something about people's noggins and the knots in them, and then the behavior that they're going to show. We can do so precisely because we can use the imagination and talk about the possibility of this. Phrenology actually doesn't talk about possibility so much as claim that it has laws, but Hegel's weakening it and saying, yeah, we can imagine possibilities that some knot actually tells us something about a person's personality or individuality, but that's not possibility that leads us anywhere. It reminds me of a great old expression, from a painted nail, only a painted coat can be hung. You can't actually hang anything on a nail that's only painted on the wall except something just as imaginary. And that's the problem with this, phrenology, is it doesn't have a real basis for the relations that it's claiming are in fact the case and can be known from the bumps on a person's skull. The observer, ignoring the mutual indifference of the two aspects, may nevertheless set to work to determine their relations, partly encouraged by the general rational principle that the outer is the expression of the inner, and partly supported by the analogy of the skulls of animals, which indeed may well have a simpler character than human beings, but of which at the same time it will be all the harder to say what character they do have, since it cannot be easy for anyone really to enter in imagination into the nature of an animal. Should, however, the observer do so, he will find in assuring us of the certainty of the laws he claims to have discovered an excellent aid in a distinction which must necessarily occur to us here too. The being of spirit cannot in any case be taken as something fixed and immovable. Man is free. It is admitted that the original being consists merely of dispositions, about which a man is free to do much as he wishes, or which require favorable circumstances for their development. That is, an original being of spirit is equally well to be spoken of as a being that does not exist qua being. Were observations therefore to conflict with what someone happens to maintain is a law, should it happen to be fine weather at the annual fair or on wash day, then the dealer and housewife might say that it really ought to rain, and that the tendency to rain is certainly present. So too, when observing the skull, it might be said that this individual really ought to be what, according to the law, his skull proclaims him to be, and that he has an original disposition, but one that has not been developed. This quality is not present, but it ought to be present. The law and the ought are based on observation of actual rainfall, and on the actual significance in the case of this particular characteristic feature of the skull. But if the reality is not present, the empty possibility serves equally well. This possibility, that is, non-actuality of the stated law, and hence the observations conflicting with the law, inevitably result from the fact that the freedom of the individual and the developing circumstances are indifferent to being as such, or to what merely is. Indifferent to being, both as an original inner and as an outer osseous form. And this also from the fact that the individual can be something else than he is by inner disposition, and still more than what he is as a bone. What Hegel is trying to show us, and I think indeed succeeding in showing us in paragraph 337, is that any discipline like phrenology that's taking something that's an external and essentially something that is dead or understood as living, but living in the mode of mere being, merely organic, but not organic in the sense that we were looking at before, where there's a spontaneity to it, is going to be inadequate to making sense out of, to providing intelligibility to, let alone predicting what it is that a human being will do and look like and even tend to do. And we can frame this in terms of the brain, which again is the organ for spirit, right? The organ by which the spirit is connected with the rest of the body. Or we can think of it in terms of spirit or mind. Geist can mean either spirit or mind. And one of the things that he says about halfway through that I put at the top of the board, I really want to stress this. Because here we're seeing the Hegel that is going to get picked up on by existentialists who themselves will often be both turning against Hegel for being too essentialist, but also using Hegel's insights. This is one of those cases of the power of the negative. He says the original, the ursprüngliche being, Sein, of spirit, of Geist, is, well, let me read the actual phrase because I've abbreviated it a little bit here. The original being of spirit is equally well to be spoken of as a being that does not exist qua, or as being. So if we want to talk about something like a metaphysics of spirit, which is what Hegel is indeed trying to provide us here, although it's a dynamically developing metaphysics, we have to understand that the kind of being that is actually possessed here is not the same kind of being as that of other beings. It almost sounds rather Heideggerian or Sartrean to say this sort of stuff. We could say that the being of a human being is not to be what objects are, although it can be reduced to an object, as we've seen, for example, in the self-consciousness section. Or what's really been going on here in this entire reason section as observing reason tries to make sense of individuality, individual reasoning human beings, tries to make sense of them. It's also trying to make sense of itself. There's a lot pregnant there in this passage. So let's go back to the start. He says, the observer ignoring the mutual indifference of the two aspects, the skull and on the other side, spirit, may nevertheless set to work to determine their relations. It's not just bare possibility. The phrenologist is using these two things. The outer is the expression of the inner. This law, which never turns out to really be a law, that we've been playing around with for the last, 40, 50 paragraphs, beginning with the first section, this first subsection of this section, Observing Reason. And then he talks about the analogy to skulls of animals. And this is quite interesting, what he has to say. He says, it may indeed well be the case that animals have a simpler character than human beings. So maybe it would make sense to observe the skulls of animals, look at wolves, look at bears, look at little bunny rabbits, we can compare them against each other. What kind of character do they show? The bumps that they have, are those bumps that show them to be lecherous animals like rabbits, or to be ravenous animals like wolves, or social animals? We can only go so far with this, right? Because we're stuck mostly with birds and mammals, and I suppose some reptiles. Maybe fish, I suppose, depending on how far you want to go with it. But then Hegel points out this problem. He says, it's harder to say what character they do have, because it's not easy for anyone really to enter in imagination into the nature of an animal. It's not enough just to look at it from the outside the way that natural historians would do back in the Middle Ages or in the ancient period and say, I think crocodiles are mean because they bite stuff and, they seem very aggressive. No, in order to actually be able to say what the crocodilian meanness is like, you'd somehow have to be able to enter into the skull of the crocodile and imagine what it's like to be this creature who's so alien to our existence. I think at this point, anybody who's read much contemporary 20th century philosophy would probably bring up Thomas Nagel's Bat essay. But it's not as if people weren't speculating about this long before, for example, Hegel right here saying, it's pretty hard to place ourselves in the consciousness of an animal, even in imagination. So he says, should the observer do so, he will find, in assuring us of the certainty of the laws he claims to have discovered, an excellent aid in a distinction which must necessarily occur to us here too. So he's saying, look, if you want to draw this analogy to skulls of animals, here's something you need to take into account. Human beings are animals. Human beings are a weird kind of animal. they are almost, we might say, unique. Why? Because the human being, the Mensch, as he says here, is free. Der Mensch is frei. So he goes on and he says, the being of spirit cannot be taken as something fixed and immovable. We can take the being of other animal consciousnesses. We understand that they're dynamic. They respond to their circumstances, their situation. They have limited plasticity. But for the most part, they don't seem to be all that flexible, all that free compared to human beings. Even pretty underdeveloped human beings are quite free by comparison to other animals that we could look at, other animals that may in fact be much better suited to their environment than, these bumbling human beings. But the human being is free. So he says it's admitted that the original being consists merely of dispositions. This is what the phrenologist is actually saying, about which a man is free to do much as he wishes, or which require favorable circumstances for their development. So there's two conditions there. I might have that bump that, it makes me tend to be a murderer, right? Or maybe it's in my DNA, we say. Or, contemporary brain science likes to locate things and what's going on in the brain and the chemistry and all that. Well, it's not necessitating me because it is just a disposition, an Anlag, right? So, what's actually going on? Well, there's not the kind of determination that we would like to have. And there may be some that require, like it says, favorable circumstances. So he says, an original being of spirit is equally well to be spoken of. And then we have this famous, or at least should be famous, sentence here that, the original being of spirit is to be a being that does not exist qua being. Does not exist as bare being, does not exist in the way of the being of mere animals. So he goes on and he says, were observation therefore to conflict with what someone maintains to be a law, this is where it gets very interesting, right? When we come up with these things about, say, the criminal type or the artistic type, right? And we get, somebody, let's just pretend for a moment that there's an actual correlation between having a big, high brow here and being artistically creative, right? Now we find some guy and he's got that big brow, but he hasn't produced anything. And we bring him to the art museum and we take him to the gallery and we dress him in a painter's outfit and we put him in front of a canvas. We say, express your creativity. I know that it's in you. And he just, kind of doodles around and, plays tic-tac-toe. And we're like, what's wrong with this guy? Well, he clearly is supposed to be. Is he just screwing with us? Is he biding his time? And we induce him. Now imagine in our thought experiment, we offer him money and we offer him prestige and we offer him his choice of available romantic or sexual partners, and we then we also bring pressure to bear on him. We're going to kill your family if you don't produce some artistic pieces. They don't have to be masterpieces. Just make some art, right? And he still doesn't do it. Well, what's going on there? Well, it's like what Hegel's talking about. It's just like that law about, it always rains when it's the fair, or whenever I take my washing out. And then suddenly it doesn't rain. What do people do in those circumstances? That's when they say, well, it should have rained. Just sort of like there's a disposition. It should have rained, but it didn't in this one case. The next time around, it sure will. You know who's prone to this sort of belief? People who have stereotypes, gamblers, all sorts of loose, sloppy thinking. It produces this sort of mindset, and Hegel's saying that's what phrenology does. So he talks here about a law and an ought. He says, the dealer and housewife would say it really ought to rain, and the tendency to rain is certainly present. So too, when observing the skull, it might be said that this individual really ought to be what, according to the law, his skull proclaims him to be. That law that's being produced here, which really isn't a law at all. So he says, the law and the order based on observation of actual rainfall. So they could be, statistically correlated. What about the laws that have to do with people's skulls? Are they really laws in this sense? He says, here we go. The actual significance in the case of this particular characteristic feature of the skull would be what we'd look at. But if the reality is not present, the empty possibility serves equally well. And here we go back to what we were talking about in the last paragraph. Phrenology is largely imaginary. And phrenology, or anything else that's like phrenology, that is, say, looking at the skull, or the physiognomy, looking at the visage, the way people walk. We might extend this to thinking about the way people dress, or what skin color they have, or the way in which they use their language. All of these sorts of things might be very similar to what's going on here. There's these tendencies. That's why I brought up stereotyping, right? People stereotype, and then when somebody is an exception to that, they say, oh, that's one of the good ones. Or, well, just give him some time and he'll conform to the stereotype. Or in this circumstance, this person, there's always some interesting explanation. But the problem is, all these things are ultimately based on the imagination. So he says, this possibility, that is the non-actuality of the stated law, and hence the observations conflicting with the law, inevitably result. Inevitably result. Why? From the fact that the freedom of the individual and the developing circumstances are indifferent to being as such. Now, what does that mean? Well, we have a being. That's very clear. I have, a certain genetic profile. You can tell I'm of a certain type, right? Height. I can modify that to a certain degree. I suppose I can stoop down a little bit, but I'm a pretty tall guy. I can get fatter. I can get thinner. I can, work out and have better musculature. But it's never going to get, to like weight, super weightlifters muscles or anything like that. And it's probably not going to get too bad either, even if I just leave it alone. There's certain physical things within which we operate, right? But those are our being. Those are Sein. Those are what we've got, right? And we have certain dispositions, right? I know I'm a person who would be classified back in the old days probably as a choleric disposition, right? Means that I tend to be impatient with people, and I have to watch it because I have a tendency to take offense too easily or to get upset about things, and it also makes me good at fighting, right? But that's a disposition. That doesn't have to be exactly what I am. Being does not determine spirit. Rather, spirit transcends mere being and decides what's going to happen with it. Also, we can talk about these circumstances too. The circumstances could exist for my talents to be developed, or imagine if I had been born back in, some backwater in, some rural area in the 1820s. Maybe I would not have done anything other than make barrels. Might have been happy, but maybe some of the talents that I would have needed in order to get to where I am, or you think about your case as well, would not have been able to be deployed. So Hegel goes on and he says, here we go. These are indifferent to being as such, or to what merely is. They're indifferent to being both as an original inner as an outer osseous form. That's the skull. And this also from the fact that the individual can be something else than he is by inner disposition, and still more than what he is as a bone. So this very fact of human beings being free, which doesn't mean that they can do anything whatsoever, right? That's that kind of silly imaginary possibility. But the fact that we do have some measure of determination, of choice, of reflexivity, means that there isn't any law here that just happens to be, abrogated in our case, but the tendency is there. The fact that that can even happen at all means it's not a law. and phrenology turns out to be a fraud. We get then the possibility that this bump or this hollow on the skull may denote something actual, as well as merely a disposition. One, moreover, that is so ill-defined as to denote something that is not actual. We see what happens, as always, to be a bad subterfuge. That is, that it is itself ready to be used against what it is supposed to support. We see mere subjective imagining brought by the very nature of the fact to say, but unthinkingly, the opposite of what it affirms. To say that by this particular bone something or other is indicated, but equally too is not indicated. There's not an awful lot to say about paragraph 338. He's just drawing a conclusion from the previous paragraphs, but we should follow it through, and you see where the contradiction is arising. And this is a contradiction that Hegel takes as sort of a stopping point. You know that contradiction can sometimes work in a very productive way in the Hegelian system, but this is one where he's saying, look, there isn't supposed to be this kind of contradiction there, and you're not really doing anything productive with it, so clearly there's a problem with phrenology. He says, we get then the possibility this bump or hollow may denote something actual as well as merely a disposition. But the disposition stuff doesn't really work because, as we've seen just in the previous paragraph, these dispositions don't determine us the way that they would, say, other animals. And so because we are free, not necessarily even radically free, but free vis-a-vis the disposition, the disposition can't be seen as something determinative. And so if we're going to connect the skull up with it and say that's this disposition is signified by this bump, not very helpful. So he goes on and he says, we see what happens to bad subterfuge. There's a sleight of hand going on here. That it is itself ready to be used against what it is supposed to support. So what we see here is a kind of contradiction occurring, right? And the contradiction reveals to us the weakness of the position. So he says, we see mere subjective imagining, that's what's been relied upon here, brought by the very nature of the fact, the conditions under which we've been looking at it, to say, but unthinkingly, the opposite of what it affirms. So it says two things at the same time that can't both be the case. He says something is indicated by this bone, and that something that we're talking about here could be something actual, something that the person does, murders, right? Or the disposition to murder, or the write poetry. Those are his preferred examples. But it also says that something is not indicated. It's not being expressed as necessary to that person. It's not necessarily going to happen. Just like the rain that should come at wash time, but doesn't show up this time. Well, he didn't murder today. Let's watch him a bit longer. Maybe he never murders his entire life. Does then that bump really mean that he was a murderer the whole time, but just didn't have his opportunity? No, you would presume that it should show up. So, that's the problem with relying upon subjective imagining. And this is something, to bring this back to Hume again, that we saw as a problem coming up in Hume, and also we might add in Blaise Pascal. You can imagine anything you like. Imagining can't be taken as an index by itself for what really is the case. It can't even be taken adequately to rule out what can't be the case. So this is a big problem because phrenology, as it turns out, doesn't have the intellectual weight that it needs in order to get past the fact that its basis is subjective imagining.